Thank you everyone for joining us this evening in our next installment in the Illinois Democratic County Chairs Association virtual training series. Tonight we have a very important topic that I'm sure a lot of you have questions on, and we're going to get to all of them as we go here. But on campaign finance and filing in Illinois. It's a difficult topic, but we have two great presenters that we're going to have go over and answer all of your questions tonight. So a couple of things before we get going. One, the training itself tonight's going to last about an hour. So we ask that you be respectful during the entire training. If you have questions, everyone's going to be muted during the training. So if you have questions, please drop them in the chat box. We'll get to them as we're going through the training tonight. But be mindful that when you're putting the questions in there, there's no stupid questions. Ask away. We have two very great presenters tonight, so let's ask as many questions as we can. But also be present during the training. As I said, it's going to be about an hour. So if you need to get up, stretch your legs, go get a glass of water, make sure you do that now before we get going. As we finish up tonight, we are going to be posting this on our YouTube page for the County Chairs Association. So if you have any follow-up questions, you can either reach out to me at dan@ILDCCA.org, or you can find us on YouTube and watch the video again. So with that, let me introduce our presenters. Our first is Sarah Nelson. Sarah has 10 years of experience with campaign disclosure and compliance, working different independent expenditure committees, statewide campaigns, and everything in between. And her partner in her firm with Nelson Worth Consulting is Emily Worth, our other presenter. Emily also has 10 years of experience with campaign finance and compliance, in her most recent position working as the Chief Financial Officer for the Democratic Party of Illinois. So with that, I will turn it over to our presenters and we'll go from there.
Awesome.
Okay, Emily, you and Sarah should be unmuted.
Great, thanks, Dan. And then can you just give me screen share real quick?
Okay, you should be good to go.
Perfect. Oh. Okay, can everybody see that? Awesome. So like Dan said, I am Emily and my partner, Sarah, and we have our own company, Nelson Worth Consulting, that basically focuses on what we're going to be talking tonight. So some of the things that we are going to be going over, again, who we are, how to form a committee, including some of the best practices that we recommend, what is a contribution, what is an expenditure, kind of the basics of campaign finance, and the basics of reporting, and then some of just our best practices, things that we've seen over the year that we just highly recommend you do kind of from the beginning. So I think Dan covered a lot of this, but this is just a brief aside about who we are. We both worked for the party. Sarah before me, and then she helped teach me a lot of what I know, and I kept going, and she went on and got her CPA. So we have a lot of experience doing campaign finance and working with the state reporting. So step one, forming a committee.
Yeah, so we'll start here. For anybody who's going to be starting a committee, and maybe you guys aren't going to be starting one directly, but you might be working with candidates who are going to be creating committees, and you want to be able to help them along the way. You know, the first thing to do is, if you can, get an FEIN number. So this number is going to help you open bank accounts. It's going to help you be recognized as a committee and not just necessarily you as a person. So it kind of helps differentiate that. And then it also is going to let you obtain contributions from certain entities. We'll get into that in a second, but the process is pretty straightforward. FEIN. So under step 1 where it says file for an FEIN number. So it's a federal employer identification number. The IRS has a pretty painless website, believe it or not, to get an FEIN number. You just want to be prepared with the name of the organization, so your committee name, friends of whoever, address of the organization. The important thing here, A22, is it needs to be a physical address. You can't use a PO box for this type of thing. You can use a PO box with the State Board of Elections. You can use a PO box maybe with the bank, but for the purposes of the FEIN, you're going to need a physical address. And then you'll want the name and social security number of whoever is going to be the responsible party for the committee. When you're filling out the different options, we note here that there is an option as a for-profit or not-for-profit of the different types of entities. More likely than not, you're going to be a not-for-profit. But if you want to consider different options, we always recommend, talking to an attorney or an accountant as you go through that process. But the other thing to keep in mind, so it takes maybe 10 minutes to fill out this form. They'll send you a paper copy saying, okay, here's your FEIN number, and you want to hold on to that piece of paper because the bank is probably going to want to not only see your number, but see the actual form that the IRS sends. So one thing we will repeat a jillion times during the course of this is to keep track of all of your documents, store them all, keep them all, err on the side of having them. And this is definitely an important one to make sure you label that folder FEIN for future reference. So then step 2, once you've got that FEIN number, you can go visit a bank and open a bank account. The important thing to think about when deciding which bank to go with, number 1 is, do they allow political committees to have bank accounts? Some of the bigger banks don't do it anymore, which can be a little bit annoying when it comes to access, ATMs or locations. If you need to go see a teller, it can be a little more difficult. But we wanted to list out some of the other things to think about when you're choosing where to open that account, is really just thinking about, does it make sense for you? Especially with the current situation, having online banking, being able to deposit checks remotely, pay bills online, get your bank statements online, being able to do all of that remotely is going to just make your life a lot easier. But it's also important to think about if there's minimum balance requirements. How much does it cost? Is there a monthly fee that you need to think about? So to the degree that you have some options in which bank to choose, it's definitely important to think about some of these different criteria and what will make sense for how you're going to be running that campaign, especially something that's going to exist beyond a short campaign cycle. Yeah. So then get your FEIN, you've opened your bank account, and then it comes time to filing with the actual Illinois State Board of Elections. And this D1 is your statement of organization. You're saying, hey, State Board of Elections, this is my committee. I'm going to start filing campaign reports. And when do you need to do that? When do you actually have to file that report with the State Board of Elections? And it's when you've either received in contributions or spent expenditures of $5,000 total. That's when you have to do it. You can certainly do it prior to that if you want. Some people do because they know they're going to get above that limit and they just want to do it from the beginning and know that they're in compliance and not have to worry about tracking it. If you're running a smaller campaign, maybe you want to wait and maybe you don't end up hitting it, but you have to once you hit that $5,000 mark. Or I mean, in theory, and you could technically get dinged by the state board for it. So that's just an important threshold to keep in mind. And then actually filling out the statement of organization, there's some different things that you're going to need to know. You'll probably have most of this from when you got your FEIN, but you're also going to need a couple other new pieces of information. So the name and address, again, like I mentioned, this can be a PO box. You know, depending on the type of campaign, maybe it's easiest to have a PO box that multiple people can check rather than someone's home where stuff is getting sent. The type of political committee, you know, whether you're a candidate or an independent expenditure, that kind of thing. The scope and purpose, you know, what are they running for? Who are they supporting? Or, you know, what political affiliation is the committee? The candidate's name and information. You're going to need a chair and treasurer. And every committee needs to have that, a chair and a treasurer, in addition to the actual candidate. And then where you opened your bank account, where's your money being stored? You'll want that information. And then they also have a section for, you know, years from now when you've closed out this committee, if you have any money left, what are you going to do with it? You can donate it to a nonprofit, a charity. You can donate it to another political committee, or you can technically refund it, not in excess of the amount they gave you. You could give it back to your donors also. So those are just other pieces that you're going to want to have an idea of and be prepared to answer as you fill that out. I don't know, Emily, if there's anything you want to add to that.
The only thing I would add on D1s is all of it is also amendable. If you decide to change any of those items, say you get a new chair or a treasurer, which can be the same person, you can amend it at any point in time within 10 days after those changes take place. Next section, contributions. What is a contribution? So these are the actual definitions from the Illinois Election Code, but basics of what is a contribution: anything of value that is used for your campaign. So we all know the basics of if somebody gives you money, it is a contribution. If somebody purchases something on your behalf and uses it for your campaign, that is an in-kind contribution. If you are purchasing tickets to a fundraiser that is held by a political committee, that is a contribution to that committee. If you are just giving another committee money, that is a contribution. These services, an employee donated by an employer, that's kind of falls into that in-kind category. If an employer is paying an employee to do work on your behalf, and this is separate from like you hiring an accounting firm, but if they're just saying, please go help this campaign, that is a contribution to your campaign. And then we get into what is not a contribution. And I want to highlight this first one. This is the use of personal property. It's usually called the personal services exemption. So if you are hosting in your house an event for a candidate, you are allowed to purchase up to $150 worth of, say, table foods or hors d'oeuvres or beverages that you can give out that is not a contribution to a candidate. Is considered the at-home exemption. And at-home also includes, say, apartments that can have common areas that anybody can obtain for the building and reserve. That also falls under that kind of a personal services exemption. A vendor selling a campaign food at cost. If they discount the amount that they are selling it for you, that discount is a contribution. But if they are just selling it to you at what they can purchase it themselves, that is not a contribution to your campaign. That is just a normal sale. Communicating to stockholders about from a corporation, that is not considered a contribution. So if an association or a company just decides to send something out to their regular stockholders, that includes reference to either a candidate or a political thing, that is not necessarily a contribution. There is a line there if they start going into an electioneering communication or branch out beyond their regular communications, like their regular membership or their regular stockholders. That would fall into a contribution category, but just their normal course of communication is not considered a contribution. Voter registration activities that encourage people to vote without mentioning a candidate or party are not contributions to any candidate. Loans from a bank are not contributions. They have to be reported and disclosed on your reports, but they are not, they do not fall under regular contribution limits if you go to a bank and get a loan for your campaign. And then another committee without your knowledge making an expenditure on your behalf, or what is considered an independent expenditure, is not a contribution to your campaign. So these are all things that can happen that you do not need to worry about reporting.
So then expenditures. Again, the actual, everything in quotes that you'll see on the screen, just like Emily said, this comes from the election code. You know, the number one thing to keep in mind is an expenditure must support the purpose of the committee. There's a little less, not necessarily gray area, but when you're making expenditures on behalf of the committee, you're not going to generally run in as much to the, you know, providing things at cost and that kind of thing. But when you're thinking about what the expenditure is for, that purpose is much more important on whether or not the committee should be spending that money, or whether it should be, you know, a personal expenditure. Is, you know, it can't be for personal use, for personal benefit. It needs to be for the purpose of the committee electing that person and supporting that. The other thing to keep in mind is, you know, the expenditures that most committees are going to see, pretty straightforward, right? I mean, it's going to be utilities, maybe office space. It's going to be maybe mailers, yard signs, you know, that sort of thing. It's going to be transfers to other political committees. You know, you're supporting other people in their campaigns, or maybe, you know, working on some sort of project together and you're all contributing. There could be different expenditures for that. And I think I don't know if it's on this page or the next page, but I think in this section we usually talk about reimbursements, because that's a pretty common thing. Or Emily, were you going to say something?
It's further along, I think. In the
Oh yeah, okay, perfect. So, I mean, the real name of the game for expenditures is that, you know, you're going to be spending stuff on what you anticipate. You know, it's going to be maybe some consultants, maybe some, you know, staff or people going door to door, that type of thing. And we'll get into some best practices for that a little later as well. But, you know, this part is pretty straightforward. It just really is, you know, for the purpose of the committee and what the committee was organized for.
So the next section is we're going to break down some of the meat of campaign finance. So here, and we can send this to Dan to send out to people, is a short little chart on dates for campaign finance. So A1s are contributions of $1,000 or more year round that needs to be filed within 5 business days of receipt, except for the 30 days prior to the election, and those dates are on there already, in which it needs to be filed within 2 business days. And it is business days, so weekends do not count in that countdown timeline to when things must be filed. The second quarter, or the quarterly reports, have to be filed usually on the 15th or on the Monday after the 15th, if the 15th falls on a weekend. And then, this is a slightly complicated chart, but we've got our campaign limits chart. So on the top is the giving committee, and on the bottom is the receiving committee. So this breaks down individual, whether or not a corporation or union, what your limits are from a PAC, from another candidate committee, and from a political party committee. I like to think of it as unlimited up. So when you are a political party giving upwards to another political party, or a candidate giving upwards to a political party, those are unlimited contributions. And then everybody else is limited. And as you can see, they kind of vary across the board. In general, party committees are double candidate committee limits, except for PACs. And the only other one I want to point out is, where is it at on here? So a state candidate committee or a state PAC can give up to 1,000 in aggregate during the year to a federal candidate committee or federal party committee. It is a $1,000 total limit before officially you should register with the FEC. So it's one of those things just to know that that limit does exist. And if a federal candidate comes to you and says, you can give me money, you can, but technically that is in aggregate for the entire year for all federal candidates. So just something to be aware of as a total limit.
And that's a calendar year, right, Emily?
Yes.
Or is that right, because the campaign limits, right, are sort of our election cycle years for the State Board of Elections. And so, right, for the general, for the State Board for Illinois, right, your limit starts just after the primary and then runs through the end of that year for the general, right? Whereas for this donation that you're talking about from a state committee to a federal,
it's a calendar year.
Calendar.
Yes. Yeah. So campaign finance, making expenditures. I think as Sarah said, we're going to tell you over and over, keep a record of everything. For every expenditure, a best practice is you are going to want, one, a proof of purchase. You want to have some sort of documentation that shows why you are spending the money you are spending, to show that if anybody ever asks why it's on behalf of your campaign. You want backup details. You want, if you are spending money on a mail piece, you want a copy of that mail piece to be able to show this money matches this mail piece, and that we have all the proper disclaimers on that. And that goes for pretty much everything that you are spending money on. So if you are doing a robocall, you should keep an audio file of that robocall. If you are doing a radio ad, same thing. Everything that you spend the money on, you want to have some sort of proof of why you are spending the money that you are spending. You should, if you are writing checks, you should in general try to keep a copy of the check that you are writing, or at least a record of how you are making a payment. So if it's a debit card payment, you've got your bank statements or credit card statements, you've got wire receipts. Basically document everything that you're doing. And then we get into reimbursements. If you are purchasing money on the behalf of the committee that you're working for, candidate or PAC, you are completely allowed to put money on your own credit card or pay cash for something and ask to be reimbursed by the campaign. The campaign should be reporting what you spent money on and not that they paid you money. So they should be reporting the ultimate vendor. So if I put money on my card at Staples, the campaign should be reporting Staples as the person who spent the money, or her person we spent the money from. So you should try to keep a receipt, basically, of any personal money that you spend so that you can turn it over to the campaign when you are asking for reimbursements. And then my general rule of thumb for pretty much anybody that has worked on campaign, don't put money on a personal credit card if you aren't actually ready to cover the cost of that card, and in-kind it to the candidate. Campaigns don't budget correctly, then you just find that you just made a very nice in-kind contribution. And then the third kind of reimbursement best practice is be cautious of who you're spending money on. We've had this with trackers before. Don't ask to be reimbursement, or make sure to clear if you have a staff what you're spending money on for if it ends up being a contribution to another candidate. So make sure that you are within the limits of giving them money if you're asking for reimbursement, because ultimately it is your committee giving money to that candidate's committee in that reimbursement process. And then we will be walking through a ledger in a little bit, but after you've spent money, general recommendation is make sure you're adding all money to your campaign ledger that you're spending, so that you are itemizing out everything that you spend money on. And then last but not least, document everything over and over. We are going to say that. Just keep copies of everything that you spend money on, so you are not guessing at a later date, why did I spend this money?
Right, and exactly to that point, Emily, yeah, I just wanted to reinforce the purpose of the expenditure. As I kind of mentioned earlier, for the most part, they'll be pretty straightforward, you know, yard signs or printing or, you know, having someone help out on the campaign. But to the degree that the receipt is not clear or the invoice isn't clear, you know, handwrite on that, because a couple months down the road, if you're kind of putting everything in a shoebox or everything in a file folder and you're like, okay, I'll, you know, look at this again, you know, once this busy time is over, more often than not, by the time you get to that point, you won't necessarily remember. And especially if it's a reimbursement, because, you know, that then you have to track down somebody else to find out what they spent it on. And so that's really just going to save you a lot of headaches in the long run, and especially being upfront with people about that. If they have spending authority on behalf of the committee, make sure they know what they need to be doing as well.
Yeah, no, very much so. And then just a couple compliance tips on spending money. Any money that you are spending that is a communication directed at voters should have a paid for by tagline on it. So we're talking about any sort of basically political advertising or direct mail, anything that you put on a website for a fee and your website itself, you need to be telling people paid for by and the name of the committee. The only exceptions to that are items that where it is too small to fit paid for by on it. Like if you are a campaign handing out pencils in the parades that used to happen in this world, or buttons, or if you were doing some sort of polling survey, you can avoid paid for buys on those. But otherwise, you should be telling people my campaign is paying for this ad that you are seeing.
So receipts, so contributions that you receive. So we've talked about all of the times that you're spending money, and now we talk about the, I guess, more fun part of receiving donations from other people and committees and groups. You know, again, best practice, keep copies of everything. And when we say everything, what we really mean is keep copy. As soon as you get that check in the mail, or someone hands it to you at an event, make a copy of it. If you don't have a copier, take a picture of it with your phone. Somehow have a copy that you can reference later. So you're keeping a copy of all the checks. You know, when you fill out a deposit slip, keep a copy of that. Because we'll talk about this in a little bit, but reconciling that to the bank account later is going to be very important, and it's going to be really helpful to know which checks went in which deposit. Keep a copy of any of the other reporting information from that donor. Like, you know, maybe they filled out a little piece of paper that you had sent, you know, a fundraiser mailer or something with their name and their occupation, or some checks don't have the address on it. So maybe they gave you something else, a business card with the address. Make a copy of that too, because it's going to come in handy later. And again, tracking it down afterwards is always tough. Another big thing with checks, contributions, is we really always strongly recommend batching your checks. And we just mean group them. So collect a small little pile, or, you know, wait a week, see however many you get that week, and then deposit them on that Friday. And part of the point of that is that, you know, when Emily was talking about some of the filing deadlines, if some of those checks are $1,000, if you can wait a couple days and deposit them together, then you only have to file one of those A1 reports for all of those contributions. It just makes it a lot easier to track, to share that information with a volunteer or someone that you have hired to help you do this reporting. And it's kind of a small trick that just really simplifies things down the road. And then the other important thing here, as I was mentioning, is, consolidating your checks into that deposit is because for the state board, the date that you use when you report it, the date of receipt, is the date you put it in the bank. So you have a check, and it's not the date that you get that check, but it's the date you put that check in the bank. The difference here is, so let's say you have a small event and a bunch of people donate cash. If you deposit the cash, the date of deposit is the date you deposit it, the date of receipt. But if you don't deposit that cash, say you think, I don't know, you use it to pay the tips that night, or you hold it off to the side as some sort of petty cash fund, undeposited cash, it is the date of someone handing it to you, rather than, because it wasn't deposited, there's no way to have a date of deposit. So that's just something, because especially with smaller committees, they're just more likely to have small events, small fundraisers where they're getting $20, $35 for a ticket. So that's where we often see that more, but just an important distinction to make. And again, it just, it's kind of giving you control over the process. So like we said, group the checks, copy them all at once, make a note in batch number 1, or, the date of the batch, however you want to name it, totally up to you, but it's just going to be a lot easier to track it that way. Something else that batching does is not just running to the bank with the check, lets you look into the person if you need to, if you look into the donor, or the organization or the company that sent the money, giving yourself a little wiggle room gives you some more control, and you can decide whether or not you do want to receive a contribution from that person or company. And then also within the limits that Emily talked about, depending on the activity for the committee, maybe at first you don't think you need to be tracking that, but it picks up steam, you get more attention, people are sending you more money, and that's something that you want to keep track of down the road. So again, consolidating the batches, kind of having that step process each time will just make that a lot easier. Like I said, right, you would copy a deposit slip, so you would need to create one. And you would want to double check that your pile of checks, that the amount actually matches the deposit slip, because you'd be surprised, maybe not, how many times that the bank, is off by $50 or by some pennies or some strange amounts that you don't anticipate. And so that's just another way to make your life a little easier on the reconciliation side. And once you've deposited it, we'd say put it in the ledger. And frankly, even before you deposit it, maybe you're keeping track of these donations that you've received, enter it, and then you can make a note. I deposited it on this day. If I needed to file any A1s, I did. Because again, as we talk about this batching, not only depositing a group of checks, but also go ahead and enter all of that in your ledger and all of that in IDIS. Because that way it just, that all these things match and that you've accounted for all of the money. Because it is possible, I've seen it happen where someone forgot. We should all be so lucky you have a big enough deposit to not notice you're missing $1,000 when you enter it in the reporting software, but it's happened, and then you get dinged for a late A1. And then of course, sending thank you notes is vital. And then finally, so when you're sending out those solicitations, so let's say you send someone a flyer and you're saying, hey, please, send me money, please. They're much like Emily was talking about for the mailing side and the various disclaimers, you want to say this blurb comes, from the state board website. You really just have to put in your committee name if you want, but it's just saying these are our requirements. We have to collect your name and employer. If you give us more than $500, those are the rules. It's not tax deductible. You can go to the state board website and get a copy if you want, but you just want to make sure that that's at the bottom. It doesn't have to be super prominent, but it needs to be on there if you send out any kind of solicitation like that.
And this is kind of our summary of what this all looks like in action. So we've got our sample ledger, idea being As soon as you start spending money, you record if it's a check or debit, date of purchase, name, address, city, state, zip, and again, that purpose. Why are you spending that money? And add it immediately to your ledger so that you can track that you're spending that money. Same thing with contributions. So you get your contribution in, you batch it, you put it on your receipt tracking form that gives you all of the information that you need, name of contributor, employer occupation, date of deposit, amount, if you're, and then check number. And then what you do is when you get your batch together, you get your deposit together, you get your money in your bank, and you move it over to your ledger and put, batch number 2 on the ledger and add in that that credit that you're getting in the bank. And then it's probably hard to see, but there is a small IDIS tracking form in there. So the idea being you are checking basically every box every time you put money into the bank. So on your IDIS tracking form, when you go to report it, you're saying, this is how much money I should be adding to my reporting software. And this is the total amount that I have added this quarter to my reporting software so that I know every time I put money in what the bottom line number should be, so that I'm not missing anything at any point in time, so that I'm not worrying about getting late fees for missed day ones, but I'm also not going to have to worry, at the end of the quarter about any receipts. Like, I know all of my receipts are in the system. I know they're all there. I know they're all good because I did it as I went along rather than waiting to file everything under an A1 later. And then there's that little checklist of kind of all of those steps put together. And the idea would be at the end of every month, you go and compare your bank statement to make sure that your checks are clearing, and you know which checks are cleared. You know that you actually captured everything, so there weren't any random credit card purchases that got thrown on to that you didn't get added to your ledger, so that you have an accurate cash on hand at all times during the campaign, because it's so important as you kind of come down to those final weeks of the campaign to know, can I make this additional purchase? Can I spend this money? Can I send out another robocall? Can I go up on a radio ad? Knowing that you have this done so much helps with that step. And the other thing about this, just kind of my biggest tip is you control every part of your financial process, or somebody that you trust controls every part of your financial process. So do it when you are most alert. So if you are a morning person, get up and deposit money first thing in the morning, put it all in the ledger, and move on with your day. Because knowing that it's done from start to finish, and just trusting in that whole process will just ease your mind in so many ways. So to control how you do your money.
So then we wanted to include a couple of screenshots that you're seeing here of the actual state board reporting software, the IDIS program. It's not the prettiest and it's not always the most functional, but it's free, and it's once you get used to it, you can kind of get the hang of it. It's not too complicated, but just so that you aren't surprised when you see it for the first time. Once you have your committee, you've filed your D1, you actually can email the state board and say, hey, I'd like a password, or I'd like a username and password. Here's what I'm selecting. Please give me access to the IDIS software. And you can have someone do this on your behalf. If someone's helping you with the campaign, they can also do it. But once you have that and you log in, you'll mostly be dealing with these icons on the left. They're somewhat self-explanatory. We've got receipts, those are the contributions you receive. Expenditures, those are the expenditures you make. Entities is a somewhat important one. Everything that you enter, every donor, every vendor, the candidate, the chair, the treasurer, the bank you use. All of that information has to be entered in the entities first before you can add any receipts or expenditures. So it's always a personal pet peeve of mine as I'm entering something and then I realize I've never put that vendor in before, and then I have to go back to the other screen and enter it. It's a pain, but at least it does, you can search in there, which is somewhat nice to see if you've entered it before you go down that path. But it's really, and we kind of make the point here, it is a database of everything. So it's going to have everything you put in, it keeps. And it's somewhat easy to export donors and expenditures from this. It's easier to do it this way than it is from the state board website. So if you've ever gone on there and tried to look for, a copy of or all of the contributions a particular committee received, within IDIS, it's much easier to do that. And it can also help if you're having a reconciliation issue down the road. But just wanted to show you that. And then as we were talking about, receipts and expenditures are the two big ones outside of entities. And the top box that you're looking at is for receipts. So all of the information that Emily was saying you'd want to put in the ledger, you pretty much put in here too. The receipt type, so whether it's an individual or a transfer in, is really person or corporation or union, it is an individual. If it's a PAC, a political committee, it's a transfer in. Some other stuff you might see loans. So if someone gives the committee a loan or a candidate loans themselves some money, that is a different receipt type. And then some of these other fields will become ungrayed. There are other options for other receipts. Maybe the bank refunds you something, maybe you bought something at Staples, to Emily's point, and then later return it. That money coming back in would be considered an other receipt because it's not a contribution from Staples, it's a refund. And then if you were to receive an in-kind, that's another option within the drop down. And so, you would fill in the date, the amount. There might not be a check number, but you can enter in letters there. It doesn't have to be a number. So if it was a debit card or it was cash that was spent or it was a wire, you can note that and it'll show up in the expenditure fields. You'll be able to see that. And then the donor, the description, if an in-kind, you would include a description if it's just a transfer in or an individual contribution you wanted. And then again, if it's an in-kind, there'll be a vendor to indicate. For the expenditure side, you'll basically be dealing with a few different, expenditures, straightforward, a transfer out, so you donated to another committee. Those, you would just do date, amount, check number again, however you spent that money. The purpose, so the state board gives you some options for what the purpose would be or description, but you can enter in, I guess, whatever you want. I don't know, maybe there's a character limit. I've not reached it, but usually, your office supplies, rent, mailing, printing, postage, PO box, stuff like that. And then the beneficiary defaults to your committee. So whatever committee this account belongs to is the default. But if you choose transfer out, so you're sending the County Chairman's Association or County Chair Association some money, it'll default to the beneficiary becomes that committee. But you don't necessarily have to change it, but you can double check that as you do it. And then finally, so reports due now. Let's say we just finished the second quarter report filing. If this was July 14th, there would be a little icon that would say reports due, and there'd be a link, and you could click it to actually file the report. You can go down here to previously filed and see anything you've just filed. So if I file an A1 or a quarterly report for someone, I'll go down to, as soon as I file it, I go down to that little previously filed and print off a copy of the report. And they actually do a filing receipt also with a number, a unique number for that filing, so that if the state board ever said, well, you say you filed it, we didn't receive it, you would be able to show them, here's this number. A couple other tips related to this. You can look at future reports due. So, right, it's July 20th. Technically, there's not a report due until October. But if you entered a batch and you wanted to check, oh gosh, did I enter that total right? Like, how will I know? You can go to future reports, and then there's a little magnifying glass up in the upper left, and you'll be able to preview what it would look like. And as soon as you enter something in the receipts or expenditures, it automatically populates that future report. And so it's pretty easy to see, yes, I've entered everything correctly, or oh no, I'm off somewhere, I got to figure this out.
Just a couple of our kind of best practices for keeping your committee safe and keeping it compliant. Again, our message of the day, have copies of everything. All receipts, all invoices, everything you're spending money on, everything that goes into your account. Save those records, even after your campaign is done. I believe the state board audits, and we actually just got notices about 2 different committees. They randomly audit up to 3% of committees a year. It does happen. It does not matter what size of committee you are. They will randomly audit anybody and everybody. So make sure you're saving those records. If you are keeping a running ledger, again, make sure you are taking into account all of your money so that you can budget correctly. Always reconcile. Try to do it monthly so that you are making sure you have accounted for all of your money. And if you have capacity, best practice suggests that the person reconciling the account is not the same person that spends your money or deposits your money, so that you have a second pair of eyes to make sure that everything that we say is happening is actually going into the bank and coming out of the bank. And it's just a best practice. So if for any reason there were any sort of fraud, you do have a second pair of eyes just to kind of keep track of that money. It's also just a nice best practice because, again, sometimes in the course of campaigns, you think you deposited something and it doesn't end up in your bank account because it, I don't know, fell on your car seat and never made it to the bank. And having somebody else look at those totals can really help you make sure that all of that money is the same. And last 2 are ask for help. Compliance is not super complicated, but it is very time consuming. Campaigns can get hectic and it's very easy to push this stuff on like, oh, I'll get to it later. Oh, I'll get to it later. And then the election ends and you have no records of anything, and everybody that might have been helping you just kind of picked up and went on vacation. And all of a sudden you have to try to recreate 3 months worth of activity by yourself. So ask for help, do this while it's happening. And kind of that last point, campaign finance does not stop on election day. It goes until the next quarterly. And you know, taxes still happen after election day. So make sure whoever you have helping you with this remembers that.
Exactly. And then one of the other things that we wanted to cover, because this comes up a lot, for people or campaigns who are paying individuals to help. And we're not talking about necessarily paying a vendor or someone who's incorporated or an LLC, but you know, you've hired some people to go door to door, you've hired some people to help with any aspect of your campaign, and you're hiring them or paying them as an individual. Absolute best practice, even if you don't anticipate paying them more than a couple $100, is getting a W-9 form from them. So it's an IRS produced form, and it basically asks for their name, their address, their social security number, and then they sign it. And one of the reasons this is so important is because your campaign does great, you know, oh, you've got all this money, you need to pay them even more, and you pay them over $600, $600 or more. If you pay one person or 20, regardless, each of those people, you would then need to send a 1099 the next January. So if this fall, you know, so-and-so, you know, you hire Jane Smith to go knock doors or to do whatever for the campaign, and you end up paying her $600 in January, she needs to get a 1099 so she can include that on her taxes. And this is something that comes up all the time with campaigns because, you know, you're not thinking about yourself as an employer, and really you're not, but for the IRS, they want to know that you paid these people money because they should be claiming it on their tax returns. So getting that W-9 up front is just, it's much easier than trying to text someone on January 29th, which I've done. Hey, can you call me? I need your social security number for this form. And the other really important thing here too is when you're paying people like that, is to try to get a contract, even if you trust them, even if you love them and they're your best friend, it's still good just to get something in writing, kind of saying, how much are you paying them? How long does this last? Who has like what responsibilities? Making clear that they're an independent contractor and not an employee. And, you know, there are definitely lots of friendly attorneys who I'm sure would love to help you draft something to help protect you and also protect that employee, that independent contractor. Because, you know, we've seen it multiple times of people who hire someone, pay them, they don't have a contract, and then there just ends up being some infighting a little later down the road about who was responsible for what or who paid who what. And then finally, along those lines, I know we're running out of time, having them sign something that you've paid them is really helpful. If you have a check, that's great, but you want them to turn in a timesheet ideally, especially if you're paying them hourly. Have them provide some sort of proof of what they did, have them sign it. You know, okay, I paid you your $200, have them sign some sort of receipt to verify that they accepted and received that money, so they can't come back at you later and say, hey, you never paid me that money. And then you realize you don't have a way to prove you did, even though you did. And, you know, we've seen it more than a few times, so it's just best practice to do it up front. And then I think, you know, outside of for State Board of Elections purposes, you need their name and address. Like I mentioned before, the W-9 will get that. And then for tax purposes, with the needing the social security number, the W-9 just does it all. And so it's just best practice to have them fill that out from the beginning. And I think that's it.
That's it. Questions?
Okay. Well, thank you, Sarah and Emily. It is very informative. We do have some questions here, so kind of get into the weeds a little bit. Just a reminder, folks, again, if you have any questions, please get them into the chat. We'll try and get through as many of them as we can. So first question we have up, if an individual has already raised, for instance, $2,000 and then has not raised anything for a couple of quarters, but then they do start raising again, they go over the threshold for 5,000, how do they originally report that that first 2,000 that they raised?
So if you've not created or filed your D1 yet, your D1 creation date would be the day you cross that $5,000 threshold. And when you fill out the D1, there is going to be a little, I guess, box that says cash on hand at the start of the committee. So it would be how much cash you actually have on hand before you cross that $5,000 threshold. So you would put that $2,000 cash on hand in there. When you create your committee in IDIS, they will ask you that same question. How much do you have at the start of the committee creation? And you put that 2,000. So you never actually itemize out that original $2,000. You should know still who you got that money was, because it can trip if you end up getting, I don't know, if it's from a person, it can trip your limits. But you would just fill in the 2,000 at both times on the D1 and when you create your IDIS committee.
Okay. Here's one that I wasn't too familiar with, but see if either of you have any answer on this. Once the campaign or the committee has been organized, should the committee itself enroll in the electronic federal tax payment system with the IRS? Is that something that we need to do if we're going to be paying campaign staff or, you know, people are doing get out the vote efforts, or is that just if you're technically a business?
So you certainly don't have to. I think, whether or not a committee should will be, and I'm not trying to dodge the question, it's kind of fact specific. So I think it'd be something you'd want to talk about with an accountant or a lawyer and kind of think about, how did you organize the committee? What kind of entity are you? And then I think to Dan's point, if you're anticipating and doing certain activity, then maybe it would make sense, but it's not necessarily something that you have to add to the list that you have to do. It's really going to be dependent on kind of how you organize.
If for a campaign, before they file their D1, if they did incur some campaign expenses, is there a way that the campaign can then reimburse the candidate for those early expenses?
So yes.
So yeah, if I hit a couple $100 to get to get my letterhead, get my business card, my name badge, all that stuff, but I haven't filed my D1 yet with the board, can I then go back and repay myself or reimburse myself for that?
Yes. So if you are spending it personally and not out of the campaign funds and want a reimbursement from the campaign, you would kind of just lump those expenditures together and reimburse it from the campaign. And then you're going to itemize out those receipts on the date you reimburse yourself. So it's going to look like Emily Worth spent $100 at Staples on the date the campaign reimburses me. And any additional expenses. Yeah.
Yeah. So if Emily spent that money back in April, but the campaign doesn't reimburse her until tomorrow, the expenditure within IDIS is to Staples for office supplies as of 7/21, because that's the date that the committee actually spent that money, reimbursing the person who spent the money.
And we talked a little bit about loans with the campaigns. Is there a maximum amount that an individual can loan their campaign?
Like the candidate themselves?
Yes.
No, there's no maximum. The only caveat to that is that there is and I'm going to blank on the number off the top of my head, but there is a threshold where you will break the caps for everybody in the race if you choose to loan yourself. I think it's 100,000.
Yeah, it's 100. Yeah.
Okay.
But no, otherwise you can loan yourself.
Okay.
If another person is loaning you money, they do have a limit.
And that would abide by the limits that you have on that chart that I'm going to be sending out to everyone later this week, that you'll give a breakdown of each. Yeah. Okay. For individuals who are married, is there a maximum amount as a married couple can donate to a committee or to a candidate, or is it dependent on each individual?
It is individual specific. So officially, you can't accept money from more than one person. So like when you were reporting money, if my husband and I both donated money, you could either split that contribution in half, or you say it's all from one person.
Right, like you don't enter it as from, for example, I'm Sarah, my husband is Ted. You wouldn't say the donation is from Sarah and Ted Nelson. You would just either say 100 from Sarah, 100 from Ted, or 200 from one or the other of us.
So they have separate limits under the limits chart. They can both give the max amount as individuals.
Okay. All right. Well, that's all the questions that we had so far this evening. I know the one thing I've learned with campaign finance is that when you think you have all the questions answered, there's going to be about 5 more that'll pop up. So if you have any questions after tonight, please feel free to reach out to me or to Sarah or Emily. I've put their emails in the chat, and we will send out the follow-up information after the presentation tonight. Again, we're going to post this online, So if you have any, want to go back and review anything, you're able to. It should be up tomorrow. If you need anything else, just reach out to the County Chairs Association. Let us know. With that, have a good evening, everyone.